Captain Zara Ramirez wiped the sweat and grime from her brow, glancing down at the last count of their remaining supplies. It wasn't good. Ammunition was almost gone, and their food stores had been reduced to a few stale rations. Worse, they were down to only 2 functioning energy shields, and both were flickering, barely able to keep out of the Virexian blasts. If the enemy pressed the attack again, and they would, it would be a massacre. "Captain?" A voice crackled over the comms. Ramirez looked up, meeting the eyes of Lieutenant Darnell, one of her most trusted officers. His armor was scorched and dented, and he carried a makeshift spear, crafted from a broken plasma rifle and a length of colony piping, a symbol of how desperate things had become. "What's the situation, Darnell?" Ramirez asked, keeping her voice steady despite the tension gnawing at her insides. Darnell shook his head grimly. "They're regrouping. Looks like they're bringing in more warriors for another push. We've got maybe half an hour before they hit us again. Maybe less." Ramirez bit back a curse. They were running on fumes. Reinforcements were still hours away, if they came at all. Terra Command had been too slow to respond, and now they were paying the price. The colony wasn't supposed to be a target, just a quiet outpost on the edge of nowhere. But the Virexians had changed that, turning this forgotten rock into the next battleground. "How's the ammo?" Ramirez asked. "Pretty much dry," Darnell replied. "We've got some energy cells left for the mounted cannons, but not much. After that, we're down to blades and fists." Ramirez's stomach churned. "Get the engineers to rig up whatever explosives we've got left. If we can funnel the Virexians through the main breach, we might be able to slow them down long enough for reinforcements to get here." Darnell gave a grim nod and disappeared into the smoke and chaos of the colony, shouting orders to the scattered soldiers. Ramirez glanced up at the sky, where the faint flashes of distant starship battles lit the darkened clouds. The Terran fleet was locked in a brutal contest with the Virexian forces orbiting the planet, the sight reinforcing that down here, they were on their own. "Captain!" Another voice called out, this one urgent. Ramirez turned to see Private Lonnie Cadra rushing toward her, out of breath and looking worse for wear. "We've got incoming chatter. Command says they're sending reinforcements, but they're still 2 hours out." 2 hours? Ramirez spat. "We don't have 2 hours, Private." "I know, ma'am, but it's all we've got." Ramirez's mind raced. There had to be something, anything they could use to buy more time. She cast a glance at the remaining Saranai warriors, their feathered crests barely visible through the haze. Their ancient Saurian forms moved with practiced grace as they prepared their own defensive positions. Even they looked worn down, their crests drooping in exhaustion. A sharp crack split the air, another breach in the colony wall. Ramirez ducked instinctively, pulling her rifle up to her shoulder, but the weapon felt heavier than it should have. They all did now. "Captain, we're going to need more than luck to get through this," Cadra muttered, her voice barely audible over the distant roars of the Virexians gathering for their assault. Ramirez grimaced. "We're not dead yet." As the minutes ticked down, the defenders scrambled to prepare. Lieutenant Darnell led a team to rig makeshift explosives from leftover fuel cells, stacking them behind the breach in the wall. Every hand was needed. Even the colony's civilians had taken up arms, most of them wielding improvised weapons. "Use everything you've got," Ramirez ordered, rallying her troops. "No matter how small or useless it seems, we need to keep this outpost." One of the engineers, a wiry man named Harris, came sprinting up, wiping sweat from his face. "Captain, we've rigged the colony's coolant tanks to blow. It's not much, but it'll send out a shockwave that might give them pause." Ramirez clapped him on the shoulder. "Good thinking, Harris. Set it to trigger remotely when they break through." Around her, the soldiers worked with grim determination as the Virexian forces drew nearer. The ground beneath her feet trembled as the enemy advanced. She saw one of the younger privates, barely out of training, standing frozen at the sight of the approaching wave of Virexians. Ramirez strode over and grabbed the soldier's shoulder, shaking him back to his senses. "Focus, soldier," she growled. "We've held them off before and we'll do it again. Stick to your training. We're Terrans. We don't break. The air was thick with tension, every second stretching into what felt like hours. The soldiers could hear the distant clicking of the Virexians' exoskeletons as they neared, the eerie hiss of their mandibles cutting through the silence. They knew this attack would be worse than the last. Ramirez activated her comms. "Command, this is Captain Ramirez. The Virexians are preparing their final assault. If we don't get reinforcements soon, this colony is finished." Static crackled on the other end before a distorted voice replied.
"Hold out as long as you can, Captain. Reinforcements are..."
"Reinforcements are what?" she asked into the dead line. No response came. She knew the truth. They were on their own. Ramirez clenched her fists around her rifle, surveying the battlefield one last time. Her people were ready. They'd give everything to protect this colony, even if it meant going down fighting. She turned back to Darnell, who stood at her side, his makeshift spear resting on his shoulder. "You think they'll come?" Darnell looked out at the advancing Virexians, then back at her. "Doesn't matter. We'll make them regret ever stepping foot on our soil." Ramirez scanned the perimeter again. Something caught her eye, a figure, walking toward the colony's broken wall, calm and steady, as if strolling through a park rather than a battlefield. "What the hell?" Ramirez muttered, narrowing her eyes. She lifted her rifle, zooming in on the figure. It was a man, dressed in worn but ornate clothing, like a traveler from another age. His gait was unhurried, almost casual, as though he hadn't noticed the battlefield around him. Dust swirled at his feet, but he moved through it as if untouched by the chaos. "Lieutenant Darnell, do you see this?" she asked through the comms.
"See what?"
Darnell's voice crackled back, tense and distracted. "There's someone walking straight toward us. A civilian?"
"A civilian? Out here? That's impossible. Wait."
A pause.
"Yeah, I see him now. What the hell is he doing? He's going to get himself killed."
"Not if the Virexians don't kill him first," Ramirez muttered, but she lowered her rifle, unsure what to make of the man. He didn't seem afraid. In fact, he didn't seem bothered by the war zone at all. She stepped forward, motioning for Darnell to stay back. As she neared the breach in the wall, the figure stopped just outside it, standing amidst the rubble. His eyes were sharp, scanning the colony with a strange sense of calm. Then, as if aware of her presence before she had even spoken, he turned his gaze toward her. Ramirez hesitated for a moment, then stepped through the breach. Dust and ash swirled in the wind, stinging her eyes, but the man stood unaffected, his face impassive. He was tall with dark, shoulder-length hair streaked with gray at the temples, and wore a long coat that looked out of place on this desolate battlefield. She stopped a few paces away, her rifle still held at the ready. "Who the hell are you?" she demanded. The man's eyes flicked to her weapon, then back to her. He smiled faintly, but it was a smile that held no warmth. "Ambassador Elias Corvin," he said in a voice that was smooth, calm, and almost too quiet for the chaos around them. Ramirez frowned. "How did you get here?" "Does that matter?" Corvin asked, his gaze sweeping over the ruined colony again. "You're running out of time. The Virexians will strike soon, through that pass." He gestured toward the ridge behind them, where the colony's defenses were weakest. "They'll flank you." Ramirez stiffened. She hadn't expected him to give any tactical information. "And how exactly do you know that?" "I've seen their troops there," he said simply. "If you don't move your forces now, they'll crush you." Her fingers tightened on her rifle. "We don't take advice from strangers, especially not ones who show up out of nowhere." "Then don't take advice," Elias said, shrugging. "But I suggest you move your forces if you want to live." He turned as if to leave, heading toward the colony wall. "Wait!" Ramirez lowered her rifle, slightly, but kept her guard up. "Why should we trust you?" Elias stopped, turning just enough to glance back at her. "Because if you don't, you'll all be dead in 10 minutes. Ramirez clenched her teeth. This man was infuriating, but something about the way he spoke, the confidence, the ease, made her hesitate. She had to admit, he didn't seem like someone who was wrong often. Still, she wasn't about to rely on him. Terrans didn't survive by trusting mysterious strangers. They survived by being resourceful, stubborn, and willing to fight even when all seemed lost. That's what had kept them alive against the Virexians so far, and that's what would keep them alive now. "Darnell!" Ramirez barked into her comms. "Get some eyes on that pass. If he's right, we need to be ready."
Copy that, Captain.
Darnell replied, his voice grim. Even as she gave the order, her soldiers were hard at work. They moved swiftly, setting up new defenses with what little they had left, repurposing colony debris and abandoned machinery to create barriers and choke points. Makeshift traps lined the pass, where the Virexians would be funneled into their kill zone. Minutes later, Darnell's voice crackled through the comms again. "Captain, we've got movement, just like he said. Virexians coming through the pass." Ramirez cursed under her breath. Elias Corvin had been right. She turned to where he had been standing, but the man was gone, vanished into the dust and smoke without a trace. She clenched her fists. There was no time to dwell on him now. "Everyone, get to your stations!" Ramirez shouted, her voice carrying over the battlefield. "The Virexians are coming! Hold your fire until they're in range!" The soldiers sprang into action, taking cover behind the hastily prepared defenses. Weapons were drawn and eyes were fixed on the ridge. Moments later, the first wave of Virexians crested the ridge, just as Corvin had predicted. Dozens of them, their chitinous bodies shimmering in the dull light, mandibles clicking with anticipation. Ramirez's heart pounded, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Steady! Wait for it!" The Virexians charged forward, their alien cries filling the air. They were faster, stronger, but not smarter. Not this time. "Now!" Ramirez yelled. The makeshift explosives detonated in unison, sending a shockwave through the pass. Virexians were thrown into the air, their bodies torn apart by the blast. The ones who survived the explosion stumbled through the smoke, disoriented, only to be met by a hail of gunfire from the remaining Terran troops. For a moment, it seemed like the battle had turned in their favor, but more Virexians were coming, pushing through the wreckage. Ramirez's jaw tightened. It wasn't over yet. The ground continued to shake as more Virexians pressed through the pass. Despite the success of the initial explosions, the alien tide was relentless. Captain Ramirez stood firm, her gaze fixed on the advancing enemy, her soldiers at her back. For every Virexian that fell, another seemed to take its place. This was the reality of the war, a battle of attrition, where survival was defined by clever tactics and sheer force of will. "Darnell!" Ramirez shouted over the roar of gunfire. "We're not going to hold this line if we don't pull him into the choke point!" Darnell nodded, wiping sweat and grime from his face. "Got an idea, Captain, but it's risky." "We don't have time for safe bets," Ramirez replied. "What's the plan?" Darnell crouched down, drawing a rough sketch in the dirt. "There's a section of collapsed wall over here," he pointed. "Just behind the main colony building. If we can lure the Virexians into that gap, we can trap them in the debris. We use the coolant tanks and those fuel cells we rigged, set them off while they're stuck." Ramirez considered it for a moment, the weight of the situation pressing down on her shoulders. "All right, do it. I'll pull some of the snipers to cover the choke point. The rest of you, follow Darnell's lead." As the soldiers hurried to reposition themselves, Ramirez spotted Elias Corvin again, standing just outside the battle's perimeter. He seemed utterly unbothered by the chaos around him, his eyes following the ebb and flow of the combat. Ramirez's blood boiled at his calm demeanor. Who was this man, and how could he be so sure of everything? "You still going to stand there and watch?" Ramirez growled as she approached him. "Or are you going to help?" Elias tilted his head slightly, as if amused by her challenge. "You're doing well on your own," he replied, his voice as cool as ever. "But if you're looking for more advice,
You might want to double up on the northern flank. The Phyrexians are gathering there. I'd say you have about 10 minutes before they strike.
Ramirez's eyes narrowed. And how would you know that?
I've seen their troops,
Elias said nonchalant.
just moments ago.
For a moment, Ramirez didn't respond. She hated how smug he seemed. It was impossible he could have been there and back, but something about his certainty gnawed at her. He hadn't been wrong about the pass, and if the Phyrexians were going to hit the north flank next, they needed to be ready.
Fine,
she muttered, tapping her comms. Kadra, pull the reserves to the north flank. I want those lines reinforced now. Elias offered her a small, knowing smile.
Good call.
You better be right about this, Ramirez said through clenched teeth. If they break through, this colony is done.
They won't,
Elias replied simply. Then, in a quieter tone, he added,
not with the help of an old friend.
Ramirez furrowed her brow at the cryptic comment. Old friend? But Elias didn't answer. He turned and started walking along the perimeter of the battle again, as if the conversation had never happened. As Elias's words lingered in her mind, Ramirez turned her focus back to the battlefield. They didn't have time to dwell on strange visitors and vague promises. What mattered now was staying alive. All right, people, let's move! She shouted, directing the remaining troops to fortify their positions. They had to make every second count. Darnell, get those fuel cells ready. Kadra, keep them snipers on the lookout. We're going to funnel those bastards right where we want them. The soldiers worked with a precision honed through years of war. The air was thick with the scent of burnt metal and smoke, and every breath felt heavy, but no one faltered. Despite their exhaustion, they moved quickly, repurposing broken-down colony machinery as makeshift barriers and rigging explosives to hidden weak points. Old hover platforms, now useless for transportation, were tipped over and used as cover. Crates of scrap metal became the foundation for new barricades. The few remaining drones were loaded with the last of the explosives, set to fly into the Phyrexians' ranks as soon as they got close.
Captain, we've finished setting up the traps in the debris field,
Darnell reported as he rushed back to her.
The coolant tanks are set to blow.
Good, Ramirez replied. Make sure the snipers are ready to pick off any survivors once we spring it. We're not leaving anything to chance. As Darnell sprinted off to relay the orders, Ramirez felt a rare flicker of hope. It was fragile, but it was there, an ember burning in the darkness. Maybe they could hold out. Maybe, against all odds, they could survive. And then came the familiar, terrible sound of the Phyrexians' approach. The high-pitched screech of their war cries echoed through the canyon, sending shivers down the spines of every soldier. The ground trembled as their massed forces moved in. Here they come, Ramirez muttered, gripping her rifle tightly. Hold your ground. We wait for the right moment. As the Phyrexians poured through the pass, the Terran troops launched into action. The snipers, positioned atop the remaining buildings, fired down on the advancing horde, their shots precise. The makeshift traps, tripwires rigged to discarded colony equipment, slowed the Phyrexians, causing confusion and disarray in their ranks. Private Kadra, crouched behind an overturned truck, gritted her teeth as she watched a group of Phyrexians step into the kill zone. With a quick motion, she detonated the explosives hidden beneath the rubble. The ground erupted in a fiery burst, sending alien bodies flying through the air. Ha! Kadra grinned as the debris settled. That'll teach 'em! But the victory was short-lived. More Phyrexians surged forward, their numbers seemingly endless. They just keep coming! One of the soldiers shouted. Ramirez's voice rang out over the comms. Stay calm! Fall back to the secondary line if you have to, but don't break! We can still win this! The Terrans' ingenuity kept them alive longer than anyone expected. Soldiers used every tool at their disposal, turning even the smallest advantages into life-saving moments. One group rigged an abandoned water tower to collapse, flooding a section of the battlefield and slowing the Phyrexians' advance. Another squad used colony tractors as mobile shields, pushing back the invaders with bursts of makeshift flamethrowers crafted from the colony's fuel reserves. But even with all their tactics, it was clear the enemy was wearing them down. The Phyrexians' sheer numbers were overwhelming. Ramirez felt her heart sink as she watched the north flank struggle to hold. "Come on, just a little longer," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Suddenly, Elias appeared at her side again, as though he'd been standing there all along. Ramirez didn't even flinch this time. She was too focused on the battle. "They're coming through the north flank faster than we thought," she said, barely glancing at him. "We're going to lose it." Elias's expression remained calm, almost serene.
"You're doing it well,"
he said.
"But the tide is about to shift."
Ramirez scowled. "What the hell is that supposed to mean?"
"An ally is on the way,"
Elias replied cryptically.
"Like I said, an old friend."
Ramirez shot him a look of frustration. "What ally? We're outnumbered 10-1. Who's going to help us now?" Elias's eyes flicked toward the far side of the battlefield.
"You'll see."
Before she could ask anything else, Elias turned and walked away again, disappearing into smoke and debris. Ramirez shook her head in disbelief, but there was no time to chase him. The Phyrexians were closing in, and her people needed her. Still, his words lingered in her mind. Who was this mysterious friend, and how could they possibly turn the tide of battle? The ground trembled beneath Captain Ramirez's boots as the Phyrexians mounted their final push. The elite warriors surged forward, larger and more vicious than the rest, their chitinous exoskeletons gleaming in the dying light, their mandibles scissoring in a sickening rhythm. Their war cries rose in a crescendo that shook the very air. "Here they come!" Darnell shouted, his voice strained. He stood beside Ramirez, his makeshift spear already slick with alien blood. Ramirez scanned the battlefield. The Terran and Saranai defenders had been pushed to their limits. Smoke rose from the wreckage of their traps, and bodies, both human and alien, littered the ground. The Phyrexians had forced their way through the north flank, just as Elias had predicted, and the defenses were falling apart faster than they could hold them. "Hold the line!" Ramirez bellowed into her comms. Her heart pounded as she watched more Phyrexians stream through the breach. The colony's last defenses were crumbling, the walls collapsing under the pressure of the enemy's relentless assault. But despite the chaos, the Terran soldiers didn't break. Even now, as the alien warriors closed in, they fought with every ounce of strength they had left. Private Kadra had resorted to a rusted combat knife, slicing through exoskeletons with a fury that belied her exhaustion. Darnell was shoulder to shoulder with her, his spear a blur of motion as he deflected blow after blow. "Captain!" A voice crackled over the comms. One of the engineers, Harris, his voice desperate. "We can't hold the line much longer. We've lost too many. Keep fighting!" Ramirez shouted, though she could feel the hopelessness closing in on them. They were outnumbered, outgunned. The Phyrexians were pressing in from every angle, and it was only a matter of time before they broke through entirely. "Just a little longer." Her words felt hollow, even to hear. The defenses had been ingenious, their resilience unmatched, but they were reaching the end of their limits. The air was thick with the stench of burning metal and blood. Ramirez felt a knot tighten in her gut as another explosion rocked the colony. The Phyrexians were everywhere now, their dark forms swarming over the last few barricades. They had fought hard, harder than anyone could have expected, but it wasn't enough.
"Captain,"
Darnell said quietly, his voice barely audible over the din of the battle.
"They're coming for the command center. We need to fall back."
Ramirez swallowed, the bile rising in her throat. The command center was the colony's heart. If it fell, the entire colony would be lost. She opened her mouth to give the retreat order, and then a sharp, piercing whistle cut through the noise. Ramirez froze, her breath catching in her throat. It was an unmistakable sound, clear and deliberate. She turned her head toward the source, and there, standing on a small rise just outside the battlefield, was Elias Corvin. He stood tall and unflinching, his dark coat flapping in the wind, his face set in calm determination. The whistle hung in the air, and for a brief moment, everything seemed to still. The Virexians paused, confused by the sudden sound. The Terran soldiers glanced around in bewilderment, and then it happened. The shadows around Elias began to shift and deepen, as though the very light was being drained from the air. The ground beneath his feet seemed to ripple, and the space around him distorted, twisting and warping in a way that made the hair on the back of Ramirez's neck stand on end. And then, out of the darkness, something emerged. The skipper appeared as if stepping through a tear in reality itself. Its massive form blinked into existence with terrifying grace, its fur so black it seemed to swallow the light around it. Its forward-facing eyes glowed with a faint purple hue, leaving trails of eerie light as it moved. Long, powerful limbs ended in retractable claws that gleamed in the dim light, and its massive teeth flashed as it bared them in a snarl. For a moment, the battlefield fell completely silent, the Virexians staring in shock at the creature that had materialized before them. Then the creature moved. The beast moved like a shadow given life, silent, swift, and deadly. It blinked across the battlefield in bursts of impossible speed, vanishing from one spot and reappearing in another with no warning. In the blink of an eye, it was upon the Virexians. Its claws sliced through the alien warriors as if they were made of paper. Each swipe of its massive paws left trails of glowing purple in the air, and wherever it struck, the Virexians fell in pieces. The creature's fur shimmered as it absorbed the surrounding light, making it almost invisible in the twilight, a moving shadow of death. One of the Virexian elites, a massive hulking brute covered in thick armor, charged the monster, its mandibles clacking in fury. But before it could even raise its weapon, the animal blinked out of existence, reappearing directly behind the warrior. Its claw ranked down on the Virexian's back, slicing through its armor with ease, and the alien crumpled to the ground in a heap. The Terran soldiers watched in awe as the skipper tore through the Virexian ranks. Every time the enemy tried to regroup or counter, the skipper would blink again, disappearing and reappearing in another spot, always one step ahead of them. Ramirez felt a surge of hope rise in her chest. This thing was something out of a legend. It moved with a lethal precision she had never seen before, turning the tide of the battle in an instant. But even as she marveled at its power, she knew that they couldn't just rely on it alone. They had to finish what they started. "Don't just stand there, people!" Ramirez shouted, snapping her soldiers out of their stunned silence. "We're still in this fight! Push forward! Support that thing!" The Terran soldiers, emboldened by the sight of the skipper's rampage, roared in response. They surged forward, firing their remaining weapons and launching into close combat with renewed vigor. The Virexians, disoriented and panicked by the sudden appearance, were caught off guard. Private Kadra, her knife still clenched in her hand, darted through the chaos and drove the blade into the back of a Virexian warrior's neck. Beside her, Darnell swung his spear in wide arcs, cutting down any alien that came too close. All around them, the defenders fought with a fire that had been reignited by the arrival of the skipper. Ramirez charged into the fray, her rifle cutting down a Virexian that had broken through the line. She fired off shot after shot, her heart pounding with adrenaline. The odds had shifted, but they couldn't afford to let up, not now. As the skipper continued its devastating assault, the Virexian forces began to crumble. Their elite warriors, once so fearsome, were reduced to fleeing in terror from the shadowy creature that stalked them. The battlefield, once filled with the sounds of alien war cries, was now eerily quiet. The last of the Virexians fell, their bodies littering the ground in broken heaps. The Terran soldiers stood victorious, their chests heaving with exhaustion, but their spirits unbroken. Ramirez wiped the sweat from her brow, her eyes scanning the battlefield. The skipper stood at the far edge, its purple eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. It was still watching, waiting, almost as if processing the scene. And then, with a single blink, it vanished, disappearing as suddenly as it had arrived. Elias Corvin, standing where he had been all along, lowered his hand from his lips. The whistle was gone, but its effects would not be forgotten. Ramirez approached him slowly, still catching her breath. What was that thing?" Elias smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes.
An old friend,
he said simply.
One that, like you, fights to survive.
The battlefield was eerily quiet in the aftermath of the Phyrexian defeat. Smoke still curled up from the ruined colony walls, and the air was thick with the scent of burnt metal and alien blood. The Terran soldiers stood among the debris, catching their breaths, their bodies battered, but their spirits unbroken. Captain Ramirez surveyed the scene, her chest heaving with exhaustion. She couldn't believe it. They had survived. Against all odds, they had won. "Captain!" Private Cadra jogged up to her, her face streaked with dirt but lit with a triumphant grin. "We did it! We really did it!" Ramirez nodded, feeling the weight of the battle settling in her bones. "Yeah," she muttered. "We did." But her eyes drifted toward the far side of the battlefield, where Elias Corvin had last stood, and where the skipper had vanished moments before. But not alone. As the surviving soldiers regrouped, a wave of subdued celebration swept through the colony. Laughter and cheers broke out among the weary troops. Darnell clapped a fellow soldier on the back, and even the Saranai warriors, known for their stoic composure, nodded in approval at the hard-fought victory.
"We wouldn't have made it without that thing,"
Darnell muttered as he approached Ramirez, looking over his shoulder where the skipper had disappeared.
"What the hell was it?"
Ramirez didn't answer immediately. She was thinking the same thing. The skipper had appeared out of nowhere, wreaked havoc on the Phyrexians, and then vanished just as quickly. The soldiers were in awe of the mysterious creature, but no one could say what it truly was or where it had come from. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind her. She turned to see Elias Corvin walking toward her, his long coat trailing behind him. His face was calm, as if the battle had never happened, though his eyes carried a weight that hinted at the things unseen. "Elias," she said, taking a step toward him, "you've got some explaining to do." Elias stopped a few paces away, folding his hands behind his back. He glanced around at the soldiers, all of them watching him with a mix of curiosity and unease.
"You fought well today,"
he said, his voice carrying a tone of respect.
"You should be proud, but I suppose you want to know more about me and my friend."
"That'd be nice," Darnell muttered, crossing his arms. Elias smiled faintly, though it was a smile without warmth.
"I am Elias Corvin,"
he began.
"A human ambassador, but not from your dimension."
The soldiers exchanged confused glances. Ramirez furrowed her brow, not entirely sure she had heard him correctly. "Not from our dimension?" she asked. "What the hell does that mean?"
"It means that the universe is far bigger than you can imagine,"
Elias replied.
"There are many dimensions, realms of existence parallel to your own. I come from one of those dimensions, and in my world, humans are at war with a great empire, a reptilian empire."
He paused, letting the words sink in.
"This empire,"
he continued,
"has developed a network of portals, gateways that allow them to travel instantaneously across space. They've even created a monopoly on travel, charging every species a tax to use their gates. And they rule with an iron fist, controlling not just the flow of goods, but the movement of entire civilizations."
Darnell stepped forward, his expression skeptical.
"And what does that thing have to do with any of this?"
Elias's eyes flicked toward the horizon, where the skipper had disappeared.
"The skippers are ancient creatures, beings capable of traveling not just across space, but between dimensions. They're one of the few entities that the Empire fears, because they render the Empire's portal network obsolete. The Emperor, in his greed, sought to execute the skippers and wipe them out. But some of us, humans, stood in their defense."
Ramirez exchanged glances with her soldiers, trying to process what Elias was telling them. A whole other dimension, a reptilian empire that ruled through portals, and this creature, the skipper, was part of a rebellion against them? "You helped the skipper escape execution," Ramirez guessed.
Elias nodded. "I did, and in return it helped me escape the Emperor's forces. I've been trying to return home ever since, but together, We've been moving through different dimensions, gathering allies to resist the Empire.
The soldiers fell silent for a moment, absorbing the enormity of what Elias had revealed. A war in another dimension, one that mirrored their own struggles. But one thing stood out to them. Humanity, no matter the dimension, was always fighting back.
Let me guess,
Darnell said, his tone a mixture of sarcasm and awe.
Humans in your dimension aren't the type to roll over for some empire.
Elias smiled.
No, we're not. Just like you, we fight, we survive, we adapt.
Ramirez felt a sense of pride welling up inside her. It didn't matter if this man came from another dimension. He was still human, still driven by the same relentless will to survive that had kept her and her soldiers alive all this time.
And today,
Elias continued,
you showed that same spirit. You didn't give up even when the odds were against you. That's why humanity will always endure. No matter where or when, we never stop fighting.
The soldiers stood a little straighter at his words, their exhaustion momentarily forgotten. Ramirez saw it in their faces, the same determination she had seen when the battle began. They had fought for their survival, and in doing so, they had proven something greater than just military strength. They had shown the unbreakable human spirit. Elias took a step back, his gaze shifting toward the horizon.
But this battle, it just means the beginning,
he said, his voice lowering.
The Varexians are not your only enemy. There are forces out there, greater threats than you can imagine.
Ramirez narrowed her eyes, still trying to process everything he had revealed. Greater threats?
I'm looking for allies.
Elias continued.
And the skippers are one of the few who can stand against the Emperor's forces, but we can't do it alone.
Are you asking us to join your fight? Ramirez asked, her voice cautious.
Not yet,
Elias replied, his tone cryptic.
But soon, the Emperor will notice this dimension. When that time comes, you'll have to decide.
With that, Elias turned and reached into the folds of his garments, producing the small, eerie whistle. Once again, the strange sound filled the air, echoing through the ruins of the colony. Moments later, the shadows deepened, and the skipper emerged, silent, powerful, its glowing eyes scanning the surroundings. Elias approached the creature, resting a hand on its sleek furred side. He looked back at Ramirez and the soldiers one last time, his expression softening.
Can we go home to Earth now?
He asked quietly, turning to the skipper. The creature let out a low, benign purr and shook its head in what could have been perceived as a denial to the request. Elias sighed, mounting the skipper's broad back, and with a sharp crack of energy, the two blinked out of existence, disappearing into the night.